everybody, it's Laura Clark. I am here to share with you a checklist that we've developed at NKCES that LBD teachers can use, whether you're in a resource setting or a collaborative classroom and do co-teaching in general education classrooms. This checklist is in a Google Doc, and you have the ability to manipulate it to change any of the content to fit your specific requirements for your caseload, the students that you are supporting, and any additional requirements that your district or school might have. So it's broken down into different pieces and parts of a typical day or year for an LBD teacher. And we start with the responsibilities of daily lesson plans. And again, you're going to follow your district and school requirements for how those lesson plans are developed. If there is a template that you use in your district or in your building, or if you're allowed to choose whatever kind of template you want to make sure that you have a lesson plan for each block or period of the day, whatever your school requires. You want to make sure that those lesson plans have some I can statements or learning targets that are student friendly, so that if a student looks up or you read out loud the learning target at the end of the lesson, the student could say, yes, I got it, or yeah, nope, we didn't really cover that and I don't understand. You want to make sure your lesson plans have a connection to the state academic standards, that you have connections to the students' IEP goals. So if it's a reading block that you are providing and you have 4 students in your group with reading goals and 3 students with behavior goals and 4 students with some social emotional supports, whatever kind of goals they have that you are supporting in that block or period of time, that you've got those goals and objectives there. For my students, I had kind of a master sheet that I used that had all of their goals and short-term benchmarks for students that had those. And then I had a little bit of a cheat sheet and some shortcuts. So like all of the reading goals, I started with the letter R. And if their goal focused on fluency or comprehension, I would use an F for fluency or a C for comprehension. And then if each student had a different target for words per minute or words read correctly or multisyllabic words, then I would shorthand write those codes so that I just at a very quick glance could keep in my head, okay, now remember, these are the targets we're working on for each student. If during that period or block I was going to collect any progress monitoring data, I made sure that I had those forms attached with my lesson plan, either hyperlinked in or paper copies, and some kind of a note on my lesson plan to remind me on Wednesday, you're doing progress monitoring for these 3 students. For students that have behavior supports or require some visual supports, like a picture schedule, I made sure to note that in my lesson plans. If there was any co-treatment happening, if the speech and language pathologist was with me on Tuesdays for my reading group, or if 2 students left for occupational therapy midway through our math group, I noted that in my lesson plans so that I could make sure that if I was supposed to send them, I remembered to send them, or if they were being picked up, that I was keeping an eye out to make sure that students got where they were supposed to be. If students have any daily personal care requirements or take medications at a certain time of the day, I made sure to note that in my lesson plans, again, so I don't forget. And a best practice is to, at the latest, have your lesson plans for the following week ready by Friday. Many building administrators have a requirement that those lesson plans either be available for them to review, or you send them there to them by email, or they have access through a Google Drive. But whatever your protocol is, you just want to make sure that you're following that. A best practice for us as LBD teachers is to make sure that for every student that's on our caseload, that we have a consistent way every week, if not every day, to collaborate with the general education teachers. We want to make sure that we're collaborating on lesson plans and that we are making sure that we're aligning state academic standards work. If we are co-teaching, then we for sure need to have some kind of time set aside to work on lesson plans, whether we do that collaboratively and virtually through a Google Doc, whether we physically sit down and meet once, twice, or 3 times a week, but that planning is consistently happening. We want to make sure in order to do that you're setting aside that time, and I usually put that in my Outlook calendar so that I don't forget to do that. If there are other adults that I'm working with, like instructional assistants or another teacher where we're providing instruction, I want to make sure that all of the adults that work with my students with IEPs, have reviewed the student's IEP, that they understand the supplementary aids and services and the accommodations or modifications that are being implemented for that student. If we are using co-teaching with students, we want to make sure that we're using this high evidence-based models. Parallel teaching, station teaching, alternate teaching, and team teaching are the 4 that yield the greatest results for student engagement and achievement. If you are co-teaching but haven't done a lot of training on our NKCES website, we have 2 at this moment co-teaching trainings and are adding more. So check that website for trainings to deepen your understanding. For each student, you should have their daily schedule to know where students are and to make sure that they are receiving all of their IEP minutes. Some students, including students with autism, students with intellectual disabilities, often benefit from some kind of a picture schedule or an object schedule or a written schedule for their day and for each task to help them stay on track. Some students do really well with a digital planner or using an app like Remind that sends notices to their phone if they are using a phone or an iPad throughout the day. But you want to make sure that whatever your student needs, that they have access to their daily schedule, especially if they're moving from room to room and need to be doing that independently. You want to make sure that you have a copy of their schedule throughout the day that you're able to refer back to if someone has a question, that if your student is using an independent schedule, you teach them how to use that. And you also work with all the adults that support that student who has a visual schedule, that everyone knows how to use that and how to encourage that independence for your student. If you are using visual schedules, we can use them in a variety of ways, right? We can use them for the entire day, but we can also break down instructional periods. So if, for example, during my reading block, I have 4 consistent activities I do, I can have a visual schedule just for that reading block, and I can reference that throughout instruction. Every time we add visual supports and consistent scheduling for our students, we increase their ability to be successful, to be independent, and also can decrease some anxiety on students' part because they know what's coming next and what to anticipate. So let's talk a little bit about IEP goals. For every student with whom you work that has an IEP, you want to make sure that, first of all, you can access their most current IEP, that you've reviewed every section of the IEP, and that you understand all the components. And the most important part as you begin are to make sure that you understand what progress monitoring is required, whether that's biweekly, weekly, daily, however often you're required to collect progress monitoring for every student. You want to make sure that you know how you're going to collect that data and have a system in place. To help you in your success with supporting students' IEPs, there are a number of documents created by the Kentucky Department of Education, and I've hyperlinked here to get to KDE's website, where you will find the IEP guidance document and the compliance record review document, the lesson plan handbook, and record review documents for every area of eligibility. If you have students on alternate assessment, that documentation is on KDE's website also. We have several trainings on our NKCES online learning site under the special education tab specific to IEP goal development and progress monitoring that you can dive into if you'd like to deepen your understanding. So a best practice, whether you're doing this digitally or have a paper copy, is to create some kind of an organizational system for each student's IEP goals. You need to know their service delivery minutes and where their service is supposed to be delivered. And you want to know how you are progress monitoring. A best practice that I had was I went ahead at the beginning of every month, and if I was needed to create paper copies for students to do activities or digital copies, I organized all that at the beginning of the month and had all of that either in a digital file quickly accessible or already printed out, so that at the beginning of the week on Monday, I could pull all of my progress monitoring paperwork together. And if I collected, some data on Monday, some data on Tuesday, some data on Wednesday, I just attached that with the lessons when I was going to be collecting data so that I made sure I didn't miss any students' IEP goals. And then I had a check sheet and I checked off for each student as I got that data collected. That was especially important because maybe I planned to collect at Sarah's progress monitoring data on Tuesday and we had an assembly. And so we didn't have that class. Then I needed to move that paper to Wednesday and double check, do I actually have that data? Oh no, we didn't have class on Tuesday. I need to do that today. For whatever system that you use, whether that's digitally or paper copy, any progress monitoring data and student IEP data is confidential. So you need to make sure that you're keeping that data and information secured and locked according to your district protocol, that it's never out where students and other adults could access it. A best practice as you're thinking about developing IEP goals is to collect academic data at least weekly and behavior data at least twice a week. Of course, you'll follow your district protocols and requirements if there are any specific requirements in place, and we create individualized education plans. So it might be that a student's academic goal would need to be collected more often or not as often. I would encourage you to collect data at least weekly because the requirements are that you have enough data that you can analyze student progress. And if you don't have at least weekly data, then it's hard to have enough data to analyze and make sure that your students are making progress. You do want to make sure that you are not only collecting that data, but that you are analyzing it on a very regular basis, which means after I collect the data, either that day or the next day or two, I'm going to go ahead and score that progress monitoring data that I collected, and I'm going to analyze it to say, okay, so this week Sarah read 183 words and had 5 errors. Last week she read 189 words, but she had 10 errors. So she's making progress in this way, but making more errors. You need to do some kind of an analysis. When I am in the moment collecting the data, I want to go ahead and take some time, and this isn't hours and hours of time, just a few minutes often, to reteach and provide clear and constructive feedback. So in the example I just gave of a student, and we're reading words per minute, I might say as soon as we were done reading, let's take a look at how you did today. Oh, look, today you read 183 words a minute. Let's chart that on your progress monitoring form and let her chart on her graph. And then say, I noticed that the words that you missed this week, those are all multisyllabic words. Let's review what we need to do with multisyllabic words. Let's break them down together. Take a quick debrief, maybe send that student, write those words out on a Post-it note, and let them take those words with them. But that reteach opportunity, that clear and constructive feedback, there's significant evidence that tells us that that makes a difference in student progress. We do want to overall avoid the mindset of data collection days. And by that, I mean a day that you say, okay, on Fridays, I'm not teaching. I am just collecting data all day. That implies that we have days we can waste, that where students don't need instruction. And we know that's just not the case, that students need instruction, hence they have an IEP to receive specially designed instruction. You want to, instead, ideally, as a best practice, to tie your progress monitoring into daily instruction. So maybe taking 3 or 4 minutes at the end or beginning of a lesson while students are reviewing the targets for the day to complete data collection for one student. You definitely want to have a plan in place so that you know what you're doing each day and how you're going to collect all the students' progress monitoring data. In addition to planning when and where, you want to have a system that lets you know what tools you're using in addition to when you are collecting that data. When you're thinking about data collection, I definitely had already chatted about making sure that you create tools that you can use for that week or that month so that everything is ready to go and you're not scrambling each day to create the tools that you need. In addition, another great idea is to regularly analyze that data. I mentioned earlier, it's ideal to do that in the moment or within that day. And the reason for that is that you can quickly work with a student on skills that they might be missing. Also, if you have a student who isn't making good progress, then you want to be able to talk to your administrators and say, we might need to consider calling an ARC or an IEP meeting to look at the data and see if additional supports are needed for this student. When you're thinking about students' IEP goals, it's ideal that they are implemented throughout the student's academic day and that you are keeping in mind that you're working towards those. Now, I do not mean that you would work from the beginning of the day to the end of the day on a student's reading goal and just work on reading fluency activities. But rather, what I do mean is if a student has an IEP goal where we're working on fluency and the student is now in science class and they're reading a text, I still want to keep those same strategies in mind and, if possible, implement that specially designed instruction to provide supports for the student. So where it works within the student's overall learning, we're going to continue to think about ways we can support that student through specially designed instruction. If we have students that are age 14 or in grade 8 in the state of Kentucky, we also know that we've got to start working on their transition goals. All right, let's talk about instructional assistance support. For those of us that work with instructional assistants, a few things we want to keep in mind. And they also need to have a schedule per class or per day. If they are following specific students and working with them throughout the day, they need a schedule that says, here's where I'm supposed to be when. And if they have other duties throughout the building, like working in the cafeteria, they support recess, and that's all clearly laid out in their schedule. In addition, when they have breaks, when their lunches, all of that should be in their schedule. You'll want to follow your district's protocol for how instructional assistant schedules are created. In some buildings, those are created by the teacher to whom the instructional assistant is assigned. In other buildings, the building administrators create that and then assign instructional assistants to work with us during specific times of the day. But if you are tasked with an instructional assistant's schedule, you want to make sure that you have that clearly articulated. If an instructional assistant is managing a group for which you are in charge of the content, you want to make sure you've given them a very clear lesson plan with all the materials they need. When we're thinking about classroom environments to support instruction, one of the key reminders is to make sure we're supporting students' confidentiality. We're keeping their IEP information private. No personal information is posted. So I won't have up on my whiteboard, Josh, speech at 2 on Tuesdays, because that is not keeping that information confidential. I do want to make sure that my class environment has a positive class culture and that my classroom is arranged to support the instructional needs that I have going on in my class. So whether I or an instructional assistant are working one-on-one with a student, whether we have small groups going, if I have a student or students that need a calm down space, that my room clearly denotes this is where the work happens. This is where small group is. This is the calm down space. Here is the library area. Here are group supplies. Ideally, our room is going to be clean and organized. For many of us, that can be challenging throughout the week as things get busy, but as much as possible, keeping things organized and thinking about not just the actual clutter, but visual clutter. If there's too much going on across the walls of the room and students can't find key items like the schedule for the class or the learning targets, then we need to probably clean up and reorganize. We want to make sure that we've got clear visual supports in place. If students benefit from timers or visual schedules for the day or for specific activities, those are available. That students know where they're supposed to put work and find books and locate pencils. All of that is clear. When we're thinking through those big rocks, and the biggest rock is to make sure all students feel that they are treated with dignity and respect. And this is a real student-focused goal, because that can feel different for every student. We do want to make sure that we and any other adult that are in the classroom can see and monitor every student at all times. There would never be a time when a student was working that I could not see where they were. So making sure we've got that set up. If our students use some kind of a work system, that needs to be clearly labeled and set up, whether that's file folders that they're working with, or they've got a series of tasks and boxes that they're working on. If they're going through a series of independent activities on the computer, however they are working, that's clearly labeled and clearly taught to students. In other words, can they be independent with that, and can they find everything they're supposed to do? When you walk into a room, you should be able to find the class expectations or rules that are posted, and those should be stated in positive ways. So I would not expect to walk into a room and see no running, no talking, no sitting on the top of desks. Instead, I would expect to see hands and feet to self, eyes on the teacher, use kind words. If you have a class-wide reinforcement system for great behavior, that should be clearly and stated and visible for students. We definitely want to make sure that the way we've arranged our classroom allows for multiple activities to happen. So in other words, if I've got a cluster of desks, can I use that for several different purposes if I need that? Students should be able to know where supplies are and where their personal workspaces are, especially if there are spaces where only one student should be. That's where their work is, making sure those labels are clear. We want to make sure that students can access the materials that they need so that they don't have to stop instruction or interrupt us as we're talking to find things. They should be able to find those on their own. And that the words that are coming out of our mouths as teachers are at least 3 times positive for any one correction or reminder. We also want to make sure that we have positive examples of student work that are posted. One of the biggest things I'd love to remind us, and I'm going to highlight this in a color just to keep us all on the same pages, we want to have no public shaming in our classroom. In other words, we are not going to post flip charts or move down charts, anything that would require a student to publicly acknowledge that they've been corrected. We definitely want to give students that kind of feedback, but we want to do that privately in a way that respects their dignity. And if we are giving them some kind of a feedback that they are going to be taking home, then that should be done in a folder or in some other way that, again, is private, not public. All right, we've talked a little bit about daily schedules, but I went ahead and added a separate block for that. Keep in mind, this is all personalizable. So if this section you feel like, oh, we covered that earlier, just delete this. They're all individual tables and you can delete them. You could rename this section if you would like. As you saw me do a second ago, I added color here because I think that one's really important. So if you have one in this section that you're like, oh my, I absolutely need to make sure I have those individual schedules for students, I am going to color code that yellow. You can absolutely do that. So for daily schedules, quick reminder. So we want to make sure we have a schedule for every student, and that schedule is presented in their mode of communication. So if they benefit from picture supports, that we use those. We want to make sure that instructional assistants or other adults have the schedules that they need so that they can work with the students they are supposed to. We also want to make sure that everyone that works with students understand that student confidentiality part. We want to make sure that anything that is posted visibly is respectful of student privacy, but also let students know where to go at different times. So if a student has speech at 2 o'clock. What I might post on the wall is Sam to Miss Jen at 2 p.m. And Miss Jen is the speech and language pathologist, but I'm identifying either a teacher name or maybe a room number. Sam, you're going to room 292 at 2 o'clock. Alrighty. For students that have behavior plans, and by that I specifically mean those behavior intervention plans that are part of their IEP, you want to make sure you've reviewed every student and that you are following them. You also want to make sure that every adult who works with that student has a copy of that behavior intervention plan to know what they are required to do. You want to make sure that, again, you're collecting that progress monitoring data for their behavior intervention plan and analyzing that often. If students are not making progress, then you want to talk to your administrators about possibly having an IEP meeting to revise that behavior intervention plan to either increase or change supports. For students that require visual supports like work cards or requesting a break or reinforcement, those need to be created and available. It's also a best practice to put samples of those attached to the IEP in whatever system that you are using, like Infinite Campus, so that if the student suddenly moved to a new district, that they would know the types of work that you were doing with the student. Whatever specially designed instruction that the student has, you want to make sure that you are following that and that you are monitoring across settings for consistency in implementing the behavior intervention plan, especially thinking about transition times. For students that have BIPs, we definitely want to include them in the work. So as appropriate, we want to conference with them and give them feedback and to get feedback from them on how that behavior intervention plan is working. Increasing those opportunities to make choices and utilize reinforcers can be key for students with behavior intervention plans to make sure you're all on the same page. We've talked about in other trainings, making sure you know how your student gets to school and home from school, and then think through training that the bus driver and monitor might need, things like their communication plans, any special equipment that they have. If a student has a communication plan, you want to make sure that you've trained the bus driver and monitor in how to use that system so that they can communicate with the student in their mode of communication. If there's any medical supplies or sensory supplies, we want to make sure that the bus driver and monitor have training, the same for behavior plans. You also want to think through sub-plans for transportation to make sure there's something that a sub could quickly scan through to make sure they know how to support that student. In addition, you want to think through emergency evacuation plans. So for students who walk to school or are car riders, in case of emergency, if you need to evacuate the school, are there any extra requirements that you would need to be aware of? When we're thinking about supporting students with IEPs, we know that a crucial piece is parent communication. So here's just 6 quick tips to think about. One is to make sure if the IEP or your school requires that you communicate with parents daily or weekly, that you have a system set up and that you are using that following whatever guidelines are set. You want to make sure there's a clear plan of who communicates with parents. So if, for example, the instructional assistant always walks the student out to the parent at the end of the day and the parent starts asking questions, then does the instructional assistant answer those questions or refer them back to you? You want to make sure that any conversation is documented following your district policy. So if you use a system like Infinite Campus, that you're keeping notes in there in a timely manner so that if you have a conversation by phone with the parent on Monday at 2 o'clock and the parent calls the principal Monday at 3 o'clock, will the administrator be able to find documentation of your conversation so that they can chat with that parent in a way that's respectful of those conversations? A best practice when you're looking at an annual review or reevaluation is to talk with parents in advance and get their input for development of the draft IEP, talk with them about any concerns and ideas that they have about your students' strengths and needs, and that you have an ongoing dialogue with them so that when you come to IEP meetings, that rapport has already been established. In some districts, there is a procedure set for prior to IEP meetings that you would send home draft IEPs, and you would definitely want to follow that. You want to check each student's IEP to see what the requirements are for sending home progress reports. And if there's any special equipment that's going to and from school, that you are training the parents on how to use that. If anything is going to and from school and transportation is helping support that from your hands to the parents' hands, you want to make sure your communication is clear on that. For all of your students collectively, we often call that your caseload. You want to make sure that for your caseload that you have data collected for each student's goals and that you're following the IEP requirements. You want to make sure you're carefully monitoring due dates and sharing the key components of the IEP with general education teachers. In some districts, teachers are required to create something called an IEP snapshot or an IEP quick look. There are all different names that districts might use, but whatever requirement your district has, you just want to follow that district procedure. You want to, again, make sure every adult that works with a student understands in a way that is respectful of that student's privacy and confidentiality their required SAS and accommodations. So if a student in elementary is going to music and they have a written test in 5th grade and they receive a reader or a scribe, that music teacher needs to know about that so that they can provide or request assistance with providing the student's required accommodations. Definitely making sure that you have all of your documentation together and that you are bringing that to any IEP meeting that you have so that you can discuss what the data says, that data has been summarized and you've got a graph to share. In addition, a best practice is to have student work samples that are scored and annotated in some way that shows students' progress so that if anyone has a question in the moment that you are able to speak intelligently to that. All right, we're almost to the end of some checklist ideas. Another one is to make sure you're following your district and school procedure for classroom emergency plans. We know for our students with disabilities, these plans might be bigger than just a quick evaluation. So in addition to making sure we're posting the district and school emergency plans as we're required and that we know what needs to happen, and we want to make sure that there are clear sub-plans for if we are not available that day, that people know what they're supposed to do, especially in regards to our students. If there are any medical, behavioral, or sensory needs, this one to me is key. I'll highlight that for us, that we are noting that if we have students that have curriculum-based instructions, we want to have emergency plans in place and make sure that we have all that important data available. All right. When we think about people that we might be working with to support our students, we might be working with SLPs, OTs, PTs, O&M, or BCBAs. We're also working with nurses and other professionals. We want to make sure that we are collaborating to support our students with anyone that's on their IEP or other adults that have been sent to support our students. When it's appropriate, we definitely want to connect families to agencies like Kentucky SPIN, and I did not add on this list, but I'll add it right now, and the Kentucky Autism Training Center that have parent and family support. We want to connect families to those resources. The very last thing I included is just a sample. This is what I would call a daily schedule matrix, and it just helps me as a special education teacher make sure that I have a plan in place to support each student's IEP goals. For some of us, we might have students on our caseload for which we are not providing direct instruction. Maybe another special education teacher is co-teaching and providing that specially designed instruction. So in those cases, it's super important that I know when that specially designed instruction is happening and how data is being collected and when I'm doing progress monitoring. And I did this, maybe every 2 months, I kind of created this overview for myself at the beginning of the year and then tried to revisit it several times. At the beginning of the week, I would just do a quick review this isn't something I created every week, but rather, this is kind of big picture. So when changes happen, like we have an IEP meeting and we add a new goal for a student, that I add it to my matrix just so that I have a real quick reference to know when am I supporting students, so that when people are talking about, oh, we need to do a schedule change and we need to move, the reading block for 2 weeks to do this special activity, that I can quickly look and say, oh, that's when I collect all of my data and do specially designed instruction. So if we're not having reading at this time, I need to find a different time to do that during those 2 weeks of a changed schedule. I hope this quick look was helpful to you. This is definitely something that you can evolve over time and personalize to be your own form. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. We are always happy to help.